In this screencast, we're going to talk about speciation. We'll get to speciation in a second, but before we get there, we need to actually be able to define what a species is. A species needs these two characteristics. For members or two organisms to be members of the same species, they have to, one, be able to mate, and we're talking in nature, when they would logically mate in nature, not in a zoo, not because humans interact, and even examples of like a dog and a wolf mating in nature are so few and far between. There's not a lot of evidence of that even happening. To be honest, wolves would rather kill a domesticated dog and eat it in the wild than actually mate with it like you might see in the movies. The second characteristic is that then those offspring are going to produce fertile offspring. For example, a mule is actually a cross between a mating between a horse and a donkey, but mules are actually infertile. That means they can't produce the reproductive cells, the sex cells, to then have their own offspring. So those two characteristics are what we use in science to define what a species is. So speciation, we're specifically talking about how lineages, remember essentially lines of organisms, hereditary organisms. For example, your parents, and then your grandparents, and then your great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents. That would be a lineage. It would be a direct family line, essentially. But the formation of a new species, for some reason, population, we've talked about population shift, and for some reason that we're going to get to, a small pocket sort of gets isolated from a population, and that's forming a new species. So to keep it pretty simple, we're talking about reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation, where again, for some reason there's a pocket that forms, for lack of a better way to say it, a pocket that forms within a population where there's only interbreeding within that pocket. When we say that those individuals become reproductively isolated from the rest of the population. So three things here quickly. The first one, some sort of barrier forms. This doesn't have to be a physical barrier. It can be some reason that performs or that prevents some organisms from breeding with one another. Then over long periods of time, these two separated groups keep changing due to natural selection, but they are probably changing in divergent ways. The populations are shifting away from one another. And three, eventually, the changes occur that essentially are so drastic that you have complete split between those reproductive pools. They happen to start as one population of individuals, and for some reason, some barrier forms that we're going to talk about in a second, but you end up with separate reproductive pools, reproductive populations, and there is no interbreeding. That's reproductive isolation. So quick examples of that, of reproductive isolation. One is geographic isolation. Probably the best known example that's in our country is the Grand Canyon squirrels. Now this is over time, of course, over long periods of time, but we see very similar and related characteristics in subspecies, or in two different species, but they are reproductively isolated. And to really simplify it, it's essentially two different populations of squirrels on different sides of that Grand Canyon. There's no way to physically get from one side to the other. There's no Evel Knievel squirrels that we know of, and those are geographically isolated squirrel populations. Another example of reproductive isolation is behavioral isolation. There's different examples of that. There can be that individuals have different courtship rules or behaviors or rituals. Some might have different songs that they sing to attract mates, different courting dances or displays or or ways to present themselves. Those are, we talk about as being behaviors. And the last example of this is a temporal isolation, which essentially is time. The time of day determines whether or not organisms are going to reproduce or interbreed. And over time, we've seen populations where they separate from one another because of the time of day for reproduction, or where they do most of their activities, whether they are during the daytime or at night. And again, it's just another way for organisms to become reproductively isolated from one another. So again, the two ideas here is to talk about, one, species, what defines a species, and how that relates to reproductive pools or populations where interbreeding takes place. And then we gave you some examples of reproductive isolation. Most speciation occurs because of reproductive isolation. Gave you some examples of that, but we really just need you to know or understand in general what causes reproductive isolation to occur in populations that can give rise to new species.